As you know from real estate, there are some places that are never for sale.
But never say never. Never say never.
Global chaos has led to suggestions that Canada, the UK, Australia, and New Zealand form a CANZUK Union, an entity to rival the US, European Union, even Russia and China. But how can states on opposite sides of the planet form a new superpower out of thin air? If it seems like fantasy, consider. Polling suggested 57% thought establishing a CANZUK Union would help protect Canada from the US. Polls suggest overwhelming support in the others too. So what would it mean to have these four team up, and how would a CANZUK Union stack up against the other great powers? I'm gonna throw up a map. Here are the proposed CANZUK Union members: Australia, New Zealand, Canada, and the United Kingdom. Sometimes this is called the Anglosphere Union. The idea is that these four countries establish free travel for work and study, free trade of goods and services, and cooperate on defense and diplomacy. There's even been a photoshopped CANZUK passport floating around from advocates and an imagined flag. Free movement. CANZUK citizens would be able to go from one member to the next visa-free. While there might be a delay for healthcare and welfare, they could explore, study, and reside permanently and work without restriction. For those with professional accreditation in one member state, they would receive recognition from another member without need for recertification. Economics. Trade would be tariff-free for goods and services exchanged throughout CANZUK. For example, energy exports might increase from Canada to the UK, while more people may immigrate out of the UK for Canada. Reverse season agricultural products could easily go from New Zealand to the UK, while London financial services could function freely for CANZUK members as they once did inside the European Union. Defense. In my research, I saw proposals for defense cooperation, semi-quotes essential. That could mean extending the UK's nuclear umbrella to other CANZUK members. I saw mention of deepening the existing Five Eyes intelligence sharing with or without the United States. But of course, most people assume CANZUK would also mean some form of defense integration, with CANZUK military cooperation in the Indo-Pacific or Arctic region, ensuring each other's sovereignty and protecting their widened global shipping network. On paper, the numbers sound pretty sweet, with a combined estimated population of 140 million, GDP of 8.1 trillion, military spending of 133 billion, and an area of 17.9 million kilometers squared. CANZUK could form and suddenly be the world's largest political union by landmass, with the fourth largest economy. On top of that, CANZUK members could sing from the same song sheet, so to speak, on matters of diplomacy. The United Kingdom also has one of the 5 permanent seats on the UN Security Council. That suggests an arrangement could be made to give weight to the other CANZUK members in that otherwise exclusive club. But my imaginary producer is already in my ear poking holes in this rosy narrative. It can't be that simple, and it's not. Before we can dive into CANZUK problems, I think history can help us understand why CANZUK advocates are predisposed to overlook them, why the idea of an Anglosphere Union is so darn attractive. You might already be guessing this whole CANZUK thing has its roots in British colonialism, and of course, that's correct. As the British Empire considered its future in the late 1800s, new ideas were floated for the colonies most racially like the motherland, aka the whitest, and for the colonies most culturally and politically accepting of the British and their monarch. This book, Birth of a State, linked below, is actually about a treaty between the UK and Ireland. However, I bring it up because it has helpful sections which illustrate the transition of Canada, Australia, South Africa, and New Zealand from colonies to semi-independence, dominions, and eventually just loosely associated as part of the British Commonwealth. Each had their own unique journey from direct control in London to, do your own thing. But there were voices for something different. An 1883 lecture series turned book by John Robert Seeley called for the consolidation of Britain and the colonies into a single new state. Future advocates would call this the Imperial Federation. The Imperial Federation League, then, established the year after publication of Seeley's book, called for the colonies which have been founded by our forefathers shall form with us one great organization, aka one superstate. The capital of this superstate would be in London, and there would be a federal parliament. But what would this Imperial Federation actually be? Would the Federation Parliament control trade, defense, and foreign affairs? Isn't that empire with more steps? Scotland, Wales, and Ireland were already subject to such a setup, and it wasn't always smooth sailing. Perhaps the Imperial Federation would be the exact opposite. Instead of top-down governance from London, each member would handle its own affairs and defense. The unity would be confederal, obligation-free, with the King or Queen of England as the only true bond. If that's the case, it's certainly no longer an empire, but without power, what's the point? And there wasn't unanimity on the issues. Some wanted to focus on trade, some wanted more for defense, some wanted more power for the Imperial Parliament, some more power for the former colonies. It's a wee bit of foreshadowing for when we address the biggest question, the biggest problem with CANZUK. According to Wikipedia, the greatest work of intellectual altruism in human history, the concept of Imperial Federation resurfaced in the 1950s and 60s, but this time with a new name. Quote, CANZUK was first coined by William David McIntyre in his 1967 book, Colonies into Commonwealth. I was able to confirm with another source and then get a copy of McIntyre's book from the Internet Archive, and yep, there it is, CANZUK. CANZUK dreams were dashed though when the UK drifted into the European Economic Community in 1973, later built upon to form the European Union. But after the 2016 Brexit vote to leave the EU, conservative advocates raised CANZUK as an alternative for a so-called global Britain. Instead of a supranational institution like the European Union with its soulless mix of cultures, languages, and bureaucracy, Britain could reinvigorate the Commonwealth with CANZUK. The British historian Andrew Roberts wrote in The Telegraph that, quote, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and Britain can unite as a pillar of Western civilization. Proponents noted CANZUK countries had similar race and cultural makeup, so backlash to free movement could be avoided, and each had similar earnings per capita, so immigration among members wouldn't threaten wages. Of course, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand shared English as their primary language, sorry Quebec, and they all had the English monarch on currency and as the constitutional head of state. Finally, they shared a tradition in parliamentary democracy. And that romanticism of getting the good old colonies back together, and really only the good old colonies back together, helps to explain why, when you start poking around and researching CANZUK, a lot of its potential issues are not considered thoroughly. First question, are there problems with CANZUK? Second question, are they really ready to rival the world as a brand new superpower? My answer is 1. There are lots of problems. 2. Hell no. Let's talk about why. We live in unprecedented times, so there is openness to unprecedented ideas. But why combine the UK, Canada, New Zealand, and Australia to form a union? After all, the UK just left the European Union. Why would it now form a new sporadic union with faceless bureaucrats not just across the continent, but across the globe? And maybe the answer is simple. The second Trump administration caused the international community to be ready to consider any old concept for like-minded countries. But this CANZUK idea has several complications. The most obvious issue is defense, which is why advocates for CANZUK usually leave it last and keep it vague. CANZUK would be the largest political union by landmass, and it would immediately be spread thin over a comical amount of planet Earth. Even if we ignore that a moment, adding soldiers and defense budgets together on spreadsheets doesn't actually create joint funds or interoperable forces. Think of it this way, the idea of Canada being in any way largely responsible for the defense of New Zealand is far-fetched, and it gets even more silly when we consider the tiny military forces of New Zealand involved in Canadian sovereignty claims through the Northwest Passage. The CANZUK countries already collaborate informally in the Indo-Pacific. They participate in military exercise and personnel exchanges. Formally, Canada and the UK are in NATO. All 4 countries are in the Five Eyes intelligence program with the US. It stands to reason that that's about as far as it can practically go for the theoretical CANZUK countries. Joint diplomacy would be a mess too. Canada's foreign policy today is hyper-focused on the threats from the US to become the 51st state and the trade war. Meanwhile, Australia spends a lot of its energy on China, which conducts its own trade war by limiting and tariffing Australian exports. A good description can be found in this book, Beijing Rules: How China Weaponized Its Economy. The UK spends its attention on post-Brexit European relations and the war in Ukraine. I think you see the point. This would not be a revival of the British Empire, it would be a ragtag group focused on their regions, and thus combined would be split in their attention, and thus that would undermine the entire point. Better to stay divided and conquer. There's parallel criticism on the issue of trade and economics. Again, just adding the GDPs of 4 countries together on a spreadsheet does not make an integrated economy. For better or worse, the majority of these countries' economic activity is in their regions. It's not even close. Something like 3/4 of Canada's exports go to the US. Even if that percentage were to decline in the second Trump term, it's still easier to throw products on a short flight or in a truck than to send ships across the globe to far smaller markets. Another example, Canadian oil often goes directly through pipelines to the US. Why redirect across the Atlantic and Pacific? The UK seems to understand this regional truism. Even outside the European Union, Prime Minister Starmer's government is pinning trade and defense resets with the EU. One was announced while I was writing this piece. But you could easily push back on my sweeping critique of CANZUK so far. Skepticism of defense and trade for CANZUK boiled down to logistics rather than fundamentals. So maybe these four want a little bit more trade, closer ties, some more informal defense cooperation. Alright, it's not a silver bullet, but it is a harmless aspiration. But we haven't yet touched on what I believe to be the biggest issue of all, and the easiest to overlook. It's the critical piece of the puzzle to understanding CANZUK, and the most difficult. We need to talk about politics. Advocates of CANZUK might protest my sweeping criticism so far. CANZUK can work a la carte, choosing which arrangements work best and have the most support. So if only free trade is agreeable to all four, do that. If global defense of massive territory is implausible, skip that. Pick and choose to avoid complications. To that I respond, agreeing a free trade agreement is not creating a union. The US and South Korea have a free trade agreement, so we start calling them the USK Union? Similarly, agreeing a defense arrangement is not a union. The US and Estonia have a defense pact through NATO. Should we start calling them Estus, like some sort of spell out of Skyrim? The clear answer is no. CANZUK must go beyond mere bit agreements and association. To form a political union, you have to integrate in a substantial way. Otherwise, you have a branding exercise rather than a political union. And these four countries already have a branding exercise masquerading as something bigger. It's called the British Commonwealth, and it's basically a nice thought with a costumed anachronism and a generic brand Olympics. It's a bit like the problems with the historical plans for the British Imperial Federation. Tie everyone too closely together and you haven't meaningfully reformed the empire. Conversely, create a loose confederal association without any obligation to one another, and then why even bother? Create an actual centralized CANZUK, an actual power to rival the US, EU, Russia, maybe even China, and you open a Pandora's box of aforementioned trade and defense issues and potential resentment among union members. Why resentment? Well, because a strong CANZUK would need an actual union parliament, a capital in a location, agencies with powers over the members of CANZUK. Are you going to put those agencies, that capital, that power in London alongside the monarch? Isn't that a bit on the nose? At the moment, the idea of CANZUK is ironically benefiting from the fact that the UK no longer wields anything more than soft power in its former colonies. There's no real power here, only nostalgic ceremony. Sure, these countries all share positive feelings towards one another, warmth as brothers and cousins, but does that really last when binding directives start pouring out across the globe? Look at the tensions with devolution in Wales, Scotland, and Northern Ireland for a preview of Westminster politics placed atop other countries. In such circumstances, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand might start remembering why they developed their own national identities as the empire declined. But if you don't put CANZUK institutions and power in London, say you put them in Western Canada or New Zealand's South Island, don't you invite resentment in the UK, the same anti-faraway bureaucrats, the take back control for Westminster rhetoric that drove Brexit? How will English nationalists respond to the idea that the UK share its seat on the UN Security Council? My guess? Not well. But will? You say, everyone polled in these CANZUK countries loves the idea. Polling conducted over the years shows massive support, huge majorities. If there's a will, there's a way. Well, my friend, polls are like onions, which are like ogres. They have layers. In the first layer, the one you see in headlines about CANZUK, people are likely to say they support the idea. There's only one problem. They don't know what they're being asked about. Open the 2025 commissioned online poll from CANZUK International, scroll to the very last page of graphics, and find this. Question: have you ever heard the term CANZUK? To which 74% responded no. 74%. 3/4 of respondents said they didn't have a clue what CANZUK even was. Now, I'm sure this question came early because once prompted on CANZUK, there were majorities for specific CANZUK policies like trade or counterbalancing the US. What these data are showing me is that people know next to nothing about CANZUK, and if you give them a little bit of info for Commonwealth countries team up for trade and travel, well, you can get impressive polling numbers because it sounds kind of nice. But there's no foundation here, and therefore there is no evidence there is political will to overcome the CANZUK complications. The proposed benefits from nostalgia, from warm, fuzzy feelings of kinship between Anglo countries, add in a dash of revulsion at the current state of affairs in the USA, and you can get attention for a CANZUK union. Maybe it's natural. In a moment of uncertainty, dig back for what feels familiar, what feels traditional. Dig back in history. Brexit felt destabilizing, therefore revamp the Commonwealth. Trump accelerated the arrival of the multipolar world order, well then, revive the British Empire. But the strongest form of CANZUK is not palatable, and the weakest form of CANZUK is not a union. CANZUK today is a branding exercise, not a future superpower. My channel's been doing that thing, the roller coaster views, 300,000, 3,000, 1,000, 600,000. I'm sure it's something I'm doing, but if you'd like to help me out planning ahead for the business and making this sustainable, patreon.com/William C. Fox. I appreciate your consideration and your viewership. Heads held high. Happy Warriors. Later, y'all.